There is a kind of silence almost no one has ever touched. Not just quiet, but a vast, consuming stillness, the silence of space. Those who have encountered it often say, it doesn't just surround you, it changes you. In this account of Artemis 2, 4 astronauts are described as stepping into that void, pushing farther from Earth than any crew had in over 50 years. But hidden inside that mission was something no one was talking about. According to the story, inside the Orion spacecraft, one astronaut carried something deeply personal, a Bible. That astronaut was Victor Glover, the pilot of Artemis 2, a trained engineer, a man of science, and quietly, a man of faith. Just days before launch, standing before the world, he did something unexpected. He didn't talk about achievement. He didn't speak about history. Instead, he asked for something simple: prayer. With steady composure, he said, "Pray for our crew, for the team supporting us around the world, and for the hardest mission of all, the one our families are about to begin. The mission of waiting, the mission of trusting." So, when he prepared to leave Earth, he made a decision. God's word would go with him, not as a gesture, not as a symbol, but as something he would rely on. Because where he was going, hundreds of thousands of miles from anything familiar, skill and machinery would not be enough. He would need something deeper. Faith to face what no human fully understands. Faith to stand in the presence of the infinite. Faith to hold on to who you are when everything else falls away. And what no one realized at the time was that from that overwhelming silence, Victor Glover was about to say something that would echo across the entire world. They were not just travelers. They were chosen, prepared, refined over years for a journey few in human history would ever experience. Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Koch, Jeremy Hansen. 4 individuals stepping beyond the limits that once defined our world. Carried by Orion, they moved farther from Earth than any crew in generations, past the boundary where our planet no longer feels like home, but something distant, almost unreal. For days, they existed between 2 realms, not fully of Earth, not yet part of the unknown beyond. Suspended in a stillness so complete, it does more than surround you, it begins to speak. Not in words, but in weight, in presence, in something that presses against the deepest part of the human spirit. And slowly, something began to shift. What happens when you look back and see everything you've ever known reduced to a single fragile sphere? Every memory, every war, every love, every life contained in something so small it could vanish into the darkness around it. Astronauts have tried to explain this for decades. They call it perspective. Some call it the overview effect. But language never quite reaches it, because it doesn't just inform the mind. It confronts the soul. For a brief, overwhelming moment, it feels as though you are seeing beyond yourself, beyond history, almost as if you are witnessing creation from a higher vantage point. And something inside you can't remain the same. Scripture once framed this question long before humanity ever left the ground. When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars, which you have set in place, what is mankind that you are mindful of them? Up there, that question is no longer abstract. It becomes unavoidable, and the Artemis 2 crew felt it, not as a theory, not as an idea, but as something real, something that had been waiting for this exact moment to surface. Because what they were experiencing was not just distance from Earth, it was clarity, and what came out of that clarity would become the most powerful part of this entire story. If this perspective is starting to shift how you see things, stay with this story, because what happens next goes far deeper than anyone expected. But this moment wasn't without precedent. History had already whispered something similar long before Artemis ever left the ground. In 1968, as Apollo 8 became the first crew to circle the moon, humanity crossed a threshold no one had ever crossed before. And in that distant orbit, surrounded by an unfamiliar silence, they chose not to speak about technology, but about origin. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Those words traveled across the void and reached millions listening back on Earth. It wasn't just a broadcast. It was a moment that seemed to anchor humanity, reminding us where everything began, even as we drifted farther away than ever before. Then came another moment, more private, more intimate. When Apollo 11 touched the lunar surface, before the cameras captured history, Buzz Aldrin paused. Not for the world, but for something unseen. In the stillness, he took bread, he took wine, and quietly, he reflected on words that had outlived empires. I am the vine, you are the branches. No audience, no announcement, just a man standing on another world, holding on to something eternal. And the pattern didn't end there. With Apollo 14, hundreds of Bibles reduced to microfilm journeyed beyond Earth, some even reaching the lunar surface itself, carried not for display, but as a statement. A quiet declaration tied to an ancient command: go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. Even when all the world began to mean something far beyond what anyone had imagined. Then Apollo 15. James Irwin walked the moon, but what changed him wasn't the terrain, it was the realization behind it. Confronted with the vastness of creation, something within him shifted permanently. Later he would say, God is alive, not only on Earth, but on the moon as well. And he didn't return the same man. His mission didn't end when he left space. In many ways, it had just begun. Because across missions, across years, across different crews and different eras, one thing kept surfacing, not as a script, not as a requirement, but as something deeper, as if every time humanity stepped into the unknown, it encountered something it could not ignore. And now, decades later, Artemis II was about to continue that pattern, but in a way no one was prepared for. What unfolded during Artemis II, however, felt different. More personal, more unfiltered, more real. This time, nothing was recited. No prepared lines, no borrowed words. What emerged came directly from within, raw, immediate, impossible to rehearse. As they traveled, the crew witnessed scenes that seemed almost unreal. Earth rising slowly above the edge of the moon, a fragile blue light breaking through endless darkness. Not just a planet, but everything. Every story, every life, suspended in a single glowing sphere. They saw a solar eclipse from a vantage point few humans have ever known. Light bending, shadow moving across the void in absolute silence. They looked upon the far side of the moon, where craters stretch untouched, ancient, unchanging surfaces that have never felt the presence of life. And in those moments, the universe did not feel empty. It felt vast, intentional, alive with meaning. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of His hands. What they saw echoed something written long before rockets ever existed. But the true weight of the journey wasn't in the images. It was in what those images awakened. Because at some point, unscheduled, unplanned, the crew asked for a moment to speak. Not because they had to, but because something within them could no longer remain silent. And the day they chose carried its own meaning. It was Easter, a day that speaks of resurrection, of life breaking through death, of hope rising where none should exist. A day that has endured for centuries, not as tradition alone, but as a reminder that even in the darkest places, something greater can emerge. And now, from a place farther than most have ever been, That message was about to be spoken again. Not from a pulpit, not from a page, but from the edge of the unknown. And then it happened. From deep space, on a day already filled with meaning, the crew asked for a moment to speak. It wasn't part of any checklist. No instruction, no script. It came from within, unexpected, unfiltered. What they were witnessing had stirred something too powerful to ignore. Not just thoughts, but something deeper, something that demanded to be said. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Those words had existed for centuries, but now they weren't just being remembered, they were being experienced. Victor Glover, the one who had quietly carried his Bible aboard, stepped forward to speak, not as a prepared voice, but as a man responding to what he was seeing in real time. And when he spoke, there was no performance in it, no attempt to impress, only clarity. I think these observances matter. And while we're so far from Earth, looking at the beauty of creation, one of the most important personal perspectives for me up here is that I can see the Earth as a single whole. Simple words, but spoken from that distance, they carried weight. He hadn't planned them, he later made that clear. There was no outline, no intention to deliver a message. What came out was immediate, something rising straight from the moment itself. Because when everything familiar falls away, when you're surrounded by something vast beyond comprehension, you don't speak what you prepared. You speak what is true. And in that moment, it felt as if creation itself had spoken first, and he was simply giving it a voice. The beauty of creation. That was the first thing that came through. Not data, not analysis, just awe, raw and unmistakable. It was what he saw, what stirred him, and ultimately, what he chose to give back to the world. And that choice matters, because from that distance, surrounded by the most advanced systems humanity has ever built, he could have said anything. He could have spoken about mission details, technology, achievements, but none of that rose to the surface. Instead, what remained was wonder. A quiet recognition that beneath everything we construct, everything we chase, there is something deeper, something already placed within us. A truth we often lose in the noise, yet one that returns with full force when we stand before something truly vast. The earth is the Lord's, and everything in it, the world, and all who live in it. Up there, that idea no longer feels symbolic, it feels visible. And then his words went further. As the spacecraft moved through its most distant stretch, he reflected on something far older than the mission itself. A command that has echoed across centuries. Love God. Love your neighbor. From space, those words change. Because when you look at Earth from that vantage point, you don't see nations, you don't see divisions, no borders, no lines, no walls. Just one world, fragile, unified, suspended in darkness. And suddenly, that command is no longer abstract. It becomes undeniable. What we separate was never truly separate. What we divide was never meant to be divided. For where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder and every evil practice. Down here, those divisions feel real. They shape decisions, define identities, but from above, they disappear completely. And that contrast is impossible to ignore, because what becomes clear, painfully clear, is that we are not as separate as we believe. We never were. One home, one humanity, and a message that has never lost its urgency. Love one another. Not as an idea, not as an ideal, but as the most necessary truth we keep overlooking. And from that distance, spoken without pressure, without agenda, it carried more weight than ever before. Because sometimes it takes stepping away from everything to finally see what has always mattered most. And that same perspective led him to describe Earth in a way that changes how you see everything. He looked at Earth, and he didn't just see a planet. He saw a vessel. Our planet is like a spacecraft designed to give us a home in the middle of the cosmos. Not built by human hands, not engineered in a lab, but something far more intricate, a system so complete, so perfectly sustained, it feels less like coincidence and more like intention. From that distance, the details become undeniable. An atmosphere wrapped around the planet like a shield you cannot see, but one you depend on with every breath. Water moving in cycles that never fail. Rain falling at the right moment, feeding life, sustaining generations. Every element working together in a balance, so exact, so fragile, that even the slightest shift would change everything. He set the earth on its foundations. It can never be moved. What once felt ordinary begins to look precise. What once felt random begins to feel ordered. And for the first time, he could see it from the outside. A single world, suspended in darkness, holding everything alive within it. And in that view, something becomes clear in a way it never does from the ground. Nothing about it feels accidental. Every layer, every system, every detail considered. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made. Up there, those words don't sound like philosophy. They feel observable. Because what you're looking at is not just a planet. It's a structure that holds life against impossible odds. A place prepared long before anyone could question it. And the evidence isn't hidden. It's in the rhythm of seasons that never fail. In the quiet reliability of air filling your lungs. In light returning every morning without asking permission. All of it pointing to something consistent. Something deliberate. Something that does not forget what it created. And from that distance, one realization rises above everything else. This world is not just where we live. It is something we were given. But Glover was not the only one moved by what they were seeing. Another perspective emerged, quiet, but just as powerful. Jeremy Hansen reflected on something that went beyond the mission itself, beyond exploration, beyond progress. He spoke about a calling that has echoed far longer than any space program, a call rooted in the teachings of Jesus, a call to love, not limited by distance, not defined by culture, not divided by borders. A love that stretches farther than anything they were orbiting, a love that from that distance no longer feels symbolic but undeniable. Above all, love each other deeply, because love covers over a multitude of sins. From where they stood, that idea wasn't theoretical. It was visible. Because the farther they moved from Earth, the clearer one truth became: everything we fight over, everything we separate ourselves by, disappears. What remains is simple. One world, one people, one shared existence, fragile and finite. And yet, even as that realization settled in, something even greater was approaching. Because what they were seeing was unforgettable. Earth rising slowly over the edge of the moon, like a single light breaking through endless darkness. A blue sphere, small, but holding everything. It wasn't just a view, it was a revelation. And then came the moment no one could have prepared for. Watch closely, because in the next moments, what they experienced in total silence would change everything. Then, the moment arrived. As Orion moved behind the far side of the moon, every signal vanished. No connection, no transmission. For nearly 45 minutes, they were completely cut off, farther from human contact than anyone had ever been. No voices, no confirmation, only the structure of the spacecraft, and a silence deeper than anything we can imagine. In those final seconds before the signal disappeared, whatever was spoken would be the last thing Earth would hear. And it wasn't technical. It wasn't data. It was something else. As we prepare to lose radio contact, we feel your love from Earth. Then, nothing. Total silence. For 45 minutes, 4 human beings existed in complete isolation. No sound from Earth, no response. Just the vast stillness of space pressing in from every direction. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. In that kind of silence, something shifts. Because when every external voice disappears, what remains is whatever is deepest within you. Later, Glover spoke about that moment in the simplest way possible. No dramatics, no explanation layered in complexity. A simple prayer, not planned, not performed. Just something that rose naturally when everything else fell away. Because there is a point where technology cannot follow, a point where distance no longer matters. And in that place, beyond signal, beyond sound, what a person reaches for reveals everything. And what happened in that silence didn't stay there. Because moments like that don't just pass. They reshape the way a person sees everything. For decades, science has tried to describe what astronauts experience when they look back at Earth from space. They call it the overview effect, a cognitive shift, a sudden expansion of awareness, a realization that our world is small, fragile, interconnected. But that definition only goes so far, because what they felt wasn't just intellectual, it was personal. It was as if the distance stripped everything down to what actually matters, removing noise, removing illusion, leaving only what is real. When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars, which you have set in place, those words were written long before anyone could leave Earth. And yet, they describe exactly what was seen. Science measures distance. It calculates trajectory. It explains motion and structure. But it does not answer what it feels like to stand in front of something vast enough to silence every question you thought you understood. Because at that scale, knowledge doesn't disappear. It changes. For now we see only a reflection, as in a mirror. Then we shall see face to face. Up there, perspective is no longer theoretical. It becomes direct. And that is where the tension and the connection between science and faith begins to reveal itself. Not as opposites, but as two ways of approaching the same reality. One observes, the other interprets. One explains how things work. The other asks why they exist at all. And in that silence behind the moon, both were present, because the same journey that pushed human knowledge forward also uncovered something far older. Something that had been written, spoken, and carried across generations long before rockets ever existed. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what lies in darkness, and light dwells with him. In a place where darkness is absolute, that idea carries a different weight, because what they encountered was not just space, it was perspective stripped of distraction, a clarity that doesn't argue. It reveals, and once seen, it cannot be unseen. And then a realization begins to take shape, one that is difficult to ignore. What they experienced was not entirely new, not in essence. Because long before spacecraft, long before instruments and data, something had already been written, preserved across centuries, waiting to be understood in a completely different way. When Glover spoke about the beauty of creation, those words did not stand alone. They echoed something far older, something King David had already seen without ever leaving the ground. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. David had no telescope, no orbit, no view from beyond the atmosphere, And yet, standing beneath the same sky, he reached the same conclusion. Different time, different world, but the same realization. Because truth does not depend on distance. It reveals itself when we are ready to see it. And David didn't stop there. He asked a question that becomes even heavier when seen from space. When I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars you set in place, I ask, what is a human that you remember him? From that distance, the question sharpens. What are we on a planet so small, surrounded by something so vast? Why would anything beyond it care? And yet, the answer has always been consistent. Not abstract, not distant, but deeply personal. A creator vast enough to form galaxies, and still attentive enough to know every life within them. Lift up your eyes on high and see who created these things. That invitation was written long ago, and in this moment, it was lived out more literally than almost anyone in history. They looked higher, farther than most ever will, and what they saw aligned with what had already been declared. But there is something even harder to explain. Because thousands of years ago, when human understanding of the world was limited to imagination and myth, one ancient text made a statement that defied everything people believed at the time. He hangs the earth on nothing. No pillars, no foundations, just suspended exactly as it is. And now, from beyond that very earth, a man looked back and saw the same reality with his own eyes. Not theory, not speculation, but observation. A planet floating freely in darkness, held in place by laws no human created. And suddenly, the distance between ancient words and modern experience collapses, because what was written then is being seen now. And that raises a question that cannot be dismissed easily. How could something so precise be described so long before it could ever be verified? At that point, the conversation changes from explanation to recognition, because some truths are not invented, they are discovered. And once they are seen across time, across perspective, they carry a weight that doesn't fade. It stays. And then, everything converged into a single realization. Not theory, not interpretation, clarity. After seeing the vastness of creation, after feeling the silence where no signal reaches, after witnessing Earth as one fragile whole, one truth rose above everything else. Simple, direct, impossible to ignore. We need Jesus. Not spoken from a pulpit, not delivered as doctrine, but expressed from a place where nothing artificial remains. From a man trained in precision, standing at the edge of everything known, looking back at everything that exists for us, and recognizing what matters most. Because when everything is stripped away, achievement, identity, division, what remains is the question we cannot escape. What holds it all together? What gives it meaning? What anchors a life in something greater than itself? I am the way and the truth and the life. Those words have been repeated for centuries, but from that distance, they no longer sound like repetition. They sound like direction. Because the same view that reveals how small we are also reveals how connected everything is. And connection without purpose doesn't satisfy. For in him all things hold together, not just physically, but meaningfully. And that is what makes the moment so powerful. Because it wasn't about proving anything. It wasn't about persuading anyone. It was about recognizing something that became undeniable in that perspective. That beyond knowledge, beyond distance, beyond the limits of what we can measure, there is a need that remains constant. A need not created by circumstance, but revealed by it. And from the silence of space, from the edge of the unknown, that need was spoken out loud. Not as a conclusion forced into place, but as something that surfaced naturally when everything else fell away. And in the end, what makes this moment so powerful is what it wasn't. It wasn't a message crafted to persuade. It wasn't a speech designed to convince. There was no script behind it. Only the honest voice of a man who carried something personal into the most distant place he had ever known and found himself unable to stay silent after what he experienced. Because when you stand before something that vast, something that reshapes how you see everything, words don't come from preparation. They come from truth. What he shared was simple: the beauty of creation, a call to love one another, a recognition of something greater than ourselves. Nothing forced, nothing exaggerated, just clarity spoken from a place where distance removes distraction and perspective reveals what truly matters. For now we see only a reflection as in a mirror, then we shall see face to face. From that vantage point, differences fade, boundaries lose their meaning, and what remains is not complexity. It is essence, a world held together by something beyond itself, a humanity more connected than it often realizes, and a reminder that beneath everything we build, everything we divide, everything we chase, there is something constant, something that does not change with distance, something that does not disappear in silence. Because in a place where nothing else remains, what is real becomes unmistakable. If this story stayed with you, I want to hear your perspective. What do you think this moment really means? Is it only a powerful human moment, or does it point to something deeper? Is it coincidence that the farther we go into space, the more these questions seem to return? Because this mission was never only about distance. It became something more. A journey where the story presents a personal Bible crossing into deep space, where reflections on creation emerged without planning, where words rooted in the teachings of Jesus were described as being spoken at the edge of silence, and where the story centers on one clear statement: we need Jesus. More than half a century after Apollo 8, humanity reached outward again, and once more, the experience pointed inward. Because despite everything we've discovered, despite the reach of our instruments and the scale of our exploration, Earth still stands apart. So God created mankind in His own image, a single world, uniquely suited for life, not repeated, not replaced. And that raises a question that doesn't disappear easily. If this world is not random, then what does that mean for us? Because you don't have to leave Earth to face that question. You don't need distance to see it. Lift up your eyes on high and see who created these things. The same reality is here, in what surrounds you, in what sustains you, and in the moments when everything else becomes quiet. Victor Glover's words weren't limited to space. They apply here, in ordinary days, in uncertainty, in the moments no one else sees, because the need he spoke about is not defined by where you are. It's revealed when everything else is stripped back. And maybe that's why stories like this matter, because sometimes it only takes one moment, one shift in perspective, for something long overlooked to finally become clear. And once you see it, you don't see the world the same way again.